To avoid tragedy on the hiking trail, follow this simple rule. Stick together at all times. Trails can go from safe to deadly in a matter of seconds when groups split apart. John Utsey's heart sank when he realized his two children, who he'd just been hiking with, disappeared from sight. But when he called out his daughter's name and heard a man's voice in response, John was thrown into action. Hello, wonderful people. I'm Scott Leffler for Wonderbot. And here is Man Hiking Trail calls out for his daughter, but a different voice calls back. Sometimes the most experienced hikers are the ones who make the simplest mistakes. For the Utsey family, this hike was no different than the hundreds they'd taken before. They were overconfident, leading to a series of events John would never forget. The Utsey family were exploring the beautiful Santa Fe National Forest in New Mexico. Their path, called the Windsor Trail, had already seen thousands of families stroll through that summer. However, there was one part of the trail hikers were cautioned to avoid: the highest peak. Towering above the Utsey family was the trail's high point of 11,000 feet, the length of over 36 football fields. Even the lowest parts of the trail come in at a whopping 7,000 feet high. But John and his kids, unaware of the nightmare to come, weren't intimidated by these staggering numbers. John was admiring the views as his kids played ahead of him. They'd pass a few minutes along the way, indicating this was a safe space for children to run wild. With summer coming to a close, John was soaking up every moment. Suddenly, he could no longer hear his kids' voices. At first, John wasn't concerned. This wasn't the first time he'd trusted his kids to roam free. After all, they had all the survival gear they could carry. Little did they know these supplies would soon be urgently needed. As a veteran of the Marine Corps, John was confident in his children's survival instincts. On top of their hiking experience, his kids had been raised by a service member. Their ability to run into an emergency situation was about to be tested. After a long silence, John called out to his kids. He knew his 10-year-old would be following close behind his 12-year-old big sister. But at the top of the path, which was growing steeper and steeper, John only saw one of his children. Once John caught up to his youngest child, he realized his eldest daughter had disappeared. The two began searching for her, staying close together as they barreled over the dirt and rocks. Clearly, this part of the trail was less traveled, reminding John of the park's deadly warnings. Now his mind was racing. John's guilt was setting in. If he'd only told his kids to stay close, his daughter would be safe and sound. If anything were to happen to her, John would be absolutely devastated. Even his 10-year-old was growing fearful. They yelled and yelled until finally they got an unexpected response. John thought he heard his daughter yelling, so he shouted her name as loudly as he could. Suddenly, a deep voice cut through the trees, giving John a scare. Realizing it was a man's voice, John bolted ahead. John's dash toward the strange man's voice felt like it would never end. Time slowed down as his brain cycled through worst-case scenarios. When he heard his daughter's voice yell out again, John nearly tripped over his own feet. Finally, he'd reached the path's end, in shock by what he had found. After expecting something horrific, John was relieved to discover his daughter in one piece. They embraced, but her face was heavy with concern. Before John could ask why, he heard that strange man's voice again. The Utleys quickly realized that someone was calling for help. Suddenly, John shifted into Marine mode. After rounding up his children, the family set off to find the source of the mysterious voice calling for assistance. Together, they did a call and response, taking them further and further from the trail. Without phone service, the Utleys were this man's only hope. After 20 minutes of shouting, John and his children stumbled upon a clearing. They'd climbed down 600 yards of a steep trail, leading them to a creek. That's where John spotted a silhouette near the water. Once the Utleys approached, John realized it might be too late. He was lying beside a creek. John told KRQE News. He couldn't stand, he couldn't move, he was delirious, so he wasn't making much sense. John and his kids immediately took out their safety rations, supplying the man with fresh water and food. But things were looking grim. His lips were all chapped to the point they were bleeding, John continued. His tongue was swollen. He was super gaunt and skinny. I was like, this guy really needs help. Without medical professionals on hand, John would have to make a decision fast. Using his marine skills, John figured out the man's coordinates. The Utleys then hiked 3 miles to the trailhead, where they called 911 with the man's location. The authorities thanked John for his help and assured him they wouldn't rest until the man was found. And yet the local news said otherwise. After bringing his kids home, John was glued to TV news reports of the incident. After 8 hours of searching, the rescue crew had decided to give up. John was not going to let that happen. Early the next morning, he strapped on his boots and hit the trail once more. John retraced his steps, and sure enough, there was the man in the same place the Utleys had left him. John returned to an area with cell service, called 911 again, and led them straight to the creek. When medics finally arrived, they discovered the 50-year-old had been stranded for 14 days. Despite being without food and water for nearly 2 weeks, the crew managed to save the man's life. John and his children were delighted, and although the 50-year-old hiker was quite experienced, it would soon be revealed that he made one crucial mistake which landed him in the dire situation. You guessed it, he went hiking alone.